I agreed, Mark, over a year ago to give this talk, and needless to say, I was working on it this afternoon. So my grandfather was in West, and so one or two of my friends and people you might know may have joined us. I've seen Maggie Carter, who some might remember as Maggie Griffin, Leonard Griffin's daughter, lived on the Heath. And I've seen Andrew Johnson, who's a friend of mine who was at a talk Tony Tucker gave after the talk to you, to some old school friends of ours, and he's one. He's joining us from Spain. I wonder if someone there is Valerie Mitchell, who I specifically want to be here because she's my cousin. And most things I tell you, nobody can deny the truth or otherwise of this. You just have to trust me. But if Valerie's there, she'll keep me honest. And also there might be someone called Brian Dix there who has kept produced an amazing family history going back about 800, 900 years, and puts vast amounts of research into it, and has connected as a network of Dixes all around the world that he's put together. He rang me about 15 years ago from Durban, and we've been in touch ever since. So that's Brian Dix, another of them. And so that's that. So can I have I've wanted to say this ever since last March. First slide, please. I'm sorry, no laughs there. It was my Chris Whitty joke. Are we ready, Mark? That's lovely. So that's who we're talking about, the central figures. My grandparents, golden wedding anniversary, June, I think it was, May, June 1971, that celebration. So granddad would have been 81 and grandma was 76. So there they are, great figures. And you all think of them as Mr. Dix probably and his wife. But that shows the difference between family dynamics and public dynamics, because they're, to me, their grandma and granddad. Grandma was always the figure in the core in the home, which is good. So, first of all, what I'm not going to do is give you a load of facts and dates and boring things like that. All I can bring to the table is a particularly intimate knowledge from another side of a couple, and particularly a man who had a great effect on village life, and which still rumbles on to this day. And I would say it was a benign and good effect. They came rather like that generation of people in the 60s, like Peter Lyons and my father-in-law, Cyril Hackett, came young and full of energy and to make life better for the people. And I'd say they were forerunners of that generation. So if you could stick to the next photo, which is slide 2, please, Mark. That's it, we'll get there. There we go, slide 2. No, that's slide, there we are, that's it, stick there. Right, grandma, as a young woman. I haven't got nearly as much detail on my grandmother's background as I have on my grandfather's. And as all of you will know and recognise, I've got all sorts of questions that I want to ask, but I'll never get any answers anymore. So my narrative will have huge gaping holes in them, and that's down to the acceptance and lack of curiosity of youth, or lack of curiosity about the right things.
Oh, Mick.
Grandmother was born in, when was she born? 1897 in Normanton, Yorkshire. She was one of 10. She was the penultimate. The last child, Auntie Mona, was had cerebral palsy, not cerebral palsy. She had Down syndrome, and she lived till she was about 60. I never met her, but apparently she's a very, very happy woman and loves laying the table and helping out in the house. But I think my great grandmother must have had a quite late in life, because she also had a lot of children who didn't survive, because it's Victorian times. And her husband, Joseph, was a coal miner. And I'm told he started working the mines when he was 6 years old, which I thought is in the 1830s, which doesn't pan out. But it's quite possible, I suppose it was later. But he was certainly a coal miner. And he must have been an exceptional one, because none of his children spent their lives as coal miners themselves. They were pit managers, they were teachers, and grandma herself, believe it or not, in 1916, as a coal miner's daughter, went to Leeds University to study botany. And what I don't know is where all that came from, what her parents were like. But I do know that they were proper coal mining parents, because my mother would never fail to tell me about visits as a child to see her grandmother in Yorkshire, in Normanton, and how she and my aunt would be put in a zinc tub that men coming home from the pits would be put in, and she'd be scrubbed within an inch of her life round her neck with a wire brush. As a small child, so she was very indignant about that right to the end of her life. So she had some interesting family, as I told you. And if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. This is Uncle Jason. Now, various relatives come and see us, or we go and see them in Yorkshire. And Uncle Jason was a much older brother. I don't know if he's the oldest in the family or not. Here he's obviously in the First World War in uniform. And he was a headmaster of a grammar school in Yorkshire, I think Castleford. And he was an imposing man. And if he came to visit, we could actually feel the terror in our mothers and grandmothers and aunts and even grandfathers to a way. And we'd be polished and scrubbed and best costumes and stuff. And we had to stand in a line as he walked along us and questioned us. And that was Uncle James. But the family history says, and I'm sure it's not strictly true, it's been embroidered, but one of his young teachers said to him, you're no good as a teacher, you're rubbish teaching, you want to make a profession of this. And this young man was an art teacher, and that was Henry Moore. So how true that story is. He certainly was a head teacher when Henry Moore taught there, but you know, the rest, I like the story anyway. There were various other uncles and aunts with interesting names like Horatio and so on. And it was Horatio, I believe, who was a leader in a mining town called Wombwell in Yorkshire. And in the very hard times in the early 30s, he went to see the king to appeal on their behalf, and was met with town bands when he came back. And there was a road named after him there that I went to see, but it's just back-to-back houses with Copeland, which is the family name, Copeland Avenue on it. So that was a claim to fame there. But as I say, we saw his relatives. One of the brothers I really liked, but never found out about him, was Uncle Albert. And he was never mentioned, but he came to visit once. And I was told he was in Grandad's shed. So I crept in there to find this mysterious figure that everyone talked about in hushed tones. And there he was drinking beer and smoking cigarettes. And they couldn't get rid of him quickly enough. So Uncle Albert was, or Bertie as they called him, was the black sheep. So there's grandmother coming from that family, and who else? There's another story that's very, very germane to Hatfield Heath now, and this involves crockery. I called him uncle, but in fact he was her grandmother's nephew, so he'd have been a second cousin, something like that. But he was much older than me, big, strong, manly man. And in the war, his Uncle Jack. And in the war, he'd been taken POW, and then they'd been taken off to clear up a town of rubble after a bombing. And the guard had hit him with a rifle, and he hit him back and laid him out. And so they kept him in prison in a very small, very dark cell for several months. He came back with claustrophobia, so he spent his life as a driver for British Road Services. And he visited the area, parked a lorry in the Chelmsford Road, and stayed in his house, presumably save a few bob from his overnight. The lorry became a nuisance, and then parked it, and I'm not going to say who, but someone else's house in Hatfield Heath, and became great friends there. And these people Uncle Jack lived in Stoke-on-Trent, and he used to go crockery down. Well, the people he stayed with knew about the village, and in time he was bringing catalogues down, and people were choosing different designs. I'd help him unload the covers of his lorry, and box after box of crockery for the whole village. I didn't realise at the time I was young enough,
Messing up.
all just coming out of the back door of Spode and Copeland. I can't remember their name at the moment. Royal Dalton and Wedgwood and so on. And there it is, probably still now in some of your houses in Hatfield Heath, knocked off crockery. I don't think anybody realised quite what was going on, or else they wouldn't admit it. So it's a bit like whiskey galore, I suppose. So there's Grandma, finally. finished the degree, don't quite know what happened, must have taken teacher training thing, so she's going to start her career in teaching. She came to visit her sister, and they went for a walk in Newport near Saffron Walden, and there my grandfather saw her, took a fancy to her, spoke to her, and soon they were to wed. So now I'll take you back to the origins of my grandfather. Now the Dix family came to Steeple Bunstead in the 18th century to demolish a large house and stayed there. So it was always construction, and they went to America. That was my great-great-grandfather went to America and set up a business in Chicago. And then it was the Great Fire of Chicago. So my Ralph's father, Joseph, was born in Chicago and christened in Chicago Cathedral. But after the fire, they decided they couldn't, or his father decided they couldn't make a go of it and came back to Saffron Walden. And Joseph's younger brother, Will, was born in a terrible storm, apparently, in the Atlantic crossing, which must have been fairly dramatic for his mother. And they set up business again in Saffron Walden, and they all joined construction, and they built a lot of Saffron Walden, and they owned a big cement works there that got bigger and bigger, and at one time had about 200 employees, believe it or not. And many of the buildings, those of you who know Saffron Walden may have seen the big bunch of grapes that hangs outside the what is Boots now, but of course used to be the Rose and Crown Hotel that burnt down in Boxing Day '69 with the loss of so many lives. Well, that bunch of grapes was carved by an uncle. I'm not quite sure. I'm told it's Ben or Will, but anyway, it was definitely carved by one of them. And they built a lot of artisan cottages pre-First World War, basically, that were lived in by their workers on the cement factory. So if I could have the fourth slide, please. Thank you. So there's the family, taken sometime or other. So from the left, we have standing my great-grandfather Joseph, Ralph's father, and then seated, we've got the eldest son, which will be Uncle Arthur, Deasy, and then on his knee is Auntie Violet. And then we've got next to her is Auntie Elsie. You'll have to excuse all the aunties. No, come back, please. And then we've got standing behind again, we've got my great-grandmother, Kate, then my grandfather, Ralph. Then we've got Louis, who is the first wife of Leonard with the moustache and glasses, who, if she's here, is Valerie's father. And he looks a bit like a Central European diplomat there. And that's Uncle Edmund seating there. So a smallish family for standards of the time, but I don't know how many children Joseph and Mary lost. I'd be surprised if there were none. I mean, it was just common at the time, wasn't it? Now, of these children, now I'll come back a bit and we'll talk because the next slide is, of course, rather a lovely one of the cement works. So can we have the next slide? There we are. You see, I think they were the foreman, and seated there is Joseph and his eldest son, Deasy, ready for a day's work. And I think that's just sort of on the Newmarket side of Saffron Walden was where the cement works were. It eventually went bust because they put the railway through all the end, and they couldn't afford to get the goods, or it just wasn't economic to get the goods from where his cement works was down toward the end station. So there was a bit of a furore about there, but there we are. Or else I'd have been inheriting Blue Circle by now, perhaps. Oh, sorry, I'll be with you in a minute. They were married, by the way, in Pontefract, so there it obviously is where my grandmother came from. Well, I'll talk to you now about some of the children. First, can I have the next slide, please? Now, this was the house they built on Debden Road, 4-bedroom, big Victorian villa with a cellar. And I spent many not very happy childhoods there because by that time it was just inhabited by my Auntie Elsie. Now, Auntie Elsie had not been allowed to get married. She was told she had to look after my grandmother. And I'm told of her having to push my grandmother in one of those old-fashioned bath chairs with a single wheel and steering wheel on it, you know, a wicker back, push her from there to Newport to see Uncle Leonard and back again. So that was the sort of life she had. So I never saw her smile, I must confess, but I'm not surprised. And when we'd visit her, I was given a small wooden chair to sit on in this small dark room and given a comic that was dated from before the First World War. When she died, nothing had been thrown out of the house really for 100 years. So clearing it was quite a trial, but it was a real treasure trove. And there's 3 or 4 things I'd like to tell you about, and one will lead me into the next part of what I'm telling you. And I will get to Hatfield Heath. Is the first thing we found was a cylindrical wax phonograph made in the 1890s of my great-great-grandfather singing Rock of Ages. And there were 3 working phonographs there, and we actually got it playing, which was a shiver down the spine. The second thing we found was a big package of envelopes tied up with blue ribbon and so on. And I opened one of the letters, and it was to my Auntie Elsie from her sweetheart on the Western Front in 1916. He didn't come back.
Ah.
And that love letters he'd written. And my grandfather grabbed them from me and said, "Give them here, boy," and just threw them on the fire.
Oh.
So that was lost to history. But the third thing we found was a big trunk. And that trunk was full of children's clothes from pre-1920, school reports and all that sort of stuff. If I go to the next slide, please. Because in that trunk, in fact, it was my Auntie Violet, who died in 1920 as a 10-year-old. And everything to do with her life had been put in that trunk. And so it was a microcosm of what it was like. And we gave the trunk to Saffron Walden Museum, and they made a big exhibition out of it. And then this woman, Gillian Holman, wrote her thesis on it, and it was published as a book. And then the Saffron Walden players turned it into a play. So it's quite nice having family history like that. Poor old Auntie Violet, she had terrible ear trouble as a child. And then in 1920, they decided to operate, and she got septicemia, and there were no antibiotics. And as many people did in those days, she died trying to get better. So if I move on to the other members of the family, now Uncle Edmund I know little about other than he died in a motorcycle accident in his 20s, but he doesn't figure too much in the family mythology. Uncle Deasy, have we got Uncle Deasy? Yes, slide 8 please. No, that's not slide 8. It's the man with the bear. That's it. There is Uncle Deasy. And what you have to remember about the family was that Uncle Deasy, or Uncle Arthur, I suppose because of Dick's, was the eldest. And he and Uncle Leonard were brought up by my great-grandfather, who was very easygoing with them and really let them have their way, and they ran wild. Whereas my grandfather was brought up by my grandmother, great-grandmother must have said, "I'm fed up with this," and she decided to bring up my grandfather and Edmund. And they had a much, much stricter upbringing. So, which might explain some of the things I'm going to tell those who knew my grandfather. Now, Uncle Abe, at 19, this man, 19, it would have been about 1907 or something like that, he sailed to Australia. He got to Darwin, he spent a week, and he sailed back because he didn't like it. But he did end up as captain of the Saffron Walden. And he was famed for his Irish wolfhound that used to run into the the butchers and steal meat. And there was one that apparently he went down the street, the Irish wolfhound with a string of sausages behind him, and the butcher with his cleaver chasing him. And then Uncle Arthur became an antique dealer, and that's how he spent the rest of his life. He had a big antique shop that he lived above in Saffron Walden High Street, and I used to visit him there. And by the time I visited him, he'd had a tracheotomy, so he spoke through his throat, which was for a young child is a bit frightening, you know, the guttural stuff. But he was always lively and always had a brand new tensioning note for me, so it put all Regis back. He also had a wife who sat there and never spoke, as far as I know. I never spoke to her, called April, who had a Pomeranian. But I did learn later when everyone my cousin Valerie, who lived in Saffron Walden, was brought up there, so knew him much better and saw him day to day, that he did in the 30s and 40s even would go off to London on his own very often to meet his theatrical friends with names like Binky. So you can make what you like of that. And also Valerie says that because he's an antique dealer, she used to go to auctions with him. It's a small town, and she had to hide his cash because he was part of the ring. If you remember the old auction dealer antique ring. So he's very involved in that, and heaven knows what else, but we don't ask. Um, his younger brother Leonard, elder than my father, was quite a character. To put it mildly, he was driving cars and had a garage before the First World War. He was a great technician, so in the war he was sent off to the Navy Ordnance Department in Devon, Hatfield Heath, to be assistant to Chain Wiseman. Chain Wiseman, of course, was a great biochemist, and he was president of the British Society, or whatever it's called, Federation of Zionists. And part of the deal he had with Balfour, who was a friend of his, was, I'll tell you how to make acetone, which was vital for munitions, because he'd invented a new way, if we get Israel. And that formed one of the cornerstones that became the Balfour Declaration. And of course, you'll have been seeing that on your news only this week, the upshot of that. So, and then Uncle Leonard, he just went on doing things really, very practical man. He was president of the Essex Beekeepers Association. And they had lots of beehives in Saffron Walden. And he never wore any gear at all. He just went in there. He didn't bother with that or smoke to calm them down. You know, I think he was a bee whisperer. But I only went near it once when he said, you'll be all right, you'll be all right. And took the lid off this hive and said, looking down, the bee came straight out and stung me right in the middle of my head. And he was really taken aback by my reaction. I didn't go near his bees again, I must confess. So I told you about Granddad's family in more detail because I know more. So Granddad then went to the high school in Saffron Walden, and he became at 16 a student teacher. So 16, that would have been 2007, 1907, beg your pardon. And student teachers in those days would go to a school and they'd be given a bit of tutoring by the proper teachers, and then they'd talk to the rest of the class. And he taught at Thaxted School at the age of 16. Now that photograph you saw at their golden wedding anniversary, at that party, everybody they ever taught was invited. It was an open invite. And someone Granddad had taught at Thaxted, who was a 14-year-old, came along. So he was there 2 years older than Granddad, and Granddad was making his speech, and this man said something, shouted out, I don't recall what, and Granddad, quick as a whip out and came back. You always did talk back, so after all these years, you controlled this 79-year-old. So then Granddad, after that, he went to teacher training college in Hull. No, I don't know the years, but I know he went there. Don't know what he did there, but he was a great sportsman. And the only tale I know of Hull teacher training college that I recall, and he told me many times because he liked looking at my face, was he managed to have all his fingernails ripped off in a rugby match.
Oh, how horrible.
Yeah.
That's not
So where we are at Saffron Walden, I won't do the Ellie Gaelic and the eve of the First World War bits, but if we can have the next slide, please. Oh no, sorry, that's just crept in, but that is Kate, my great-grandmother, and Auntie Elsie there, with a dog who had a tombstone in the back garden that we also had to get rid of that dog. Great big tombstone it was, and Auntie Elsie's trying and smile there. There were three of us, and she gave us all the same Christmas present every Christmas, which was a teeny little tartan golf caddy with pencils in it, with plastic or no metal golf club heads to the pencils, and one single golf ball. I mean, somewhere. I never understood it. I mean, I didn't last past the Boxing Day, so. Anyway, the next slide, please. So that's Saffron Walden, the Empire Day in 2013. So look, they didn't know what was coming, did they? So I'm almost certain that there are Dixies in that crowd there, but who knows where. But if I can have the next slide. This is the same scene, but of course, well, the same place, but this is in April 1915, sorry, I keep saying 1915, and this, of course, is everybody coming to sign up. The army recruiters are into town, and I'm almost certain that Granddad's in there because he signed up then. So there we are. So they were all taking the King's shilling. And where did Granddad go to? Did he go to the Western Front? Was he on the last ship out to the Dardanelles on Churchill's crazed failed folly? No, he was sent to Sierra Leone, of all places. And Sierra Leone was very, very important in the First World War. It's a huge natural harbour, one of the biggest in the world. And it was used for resupplying ships, for coking them, and for pulling into harbour any captured German ships. So there was a large army presence to look after them. And if I could have the next slide, please. And there's Grandad in Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, he learnt that you must always wear a hat or you'll go mad. And I defy anyone to my grandfather wearing a hat outdoors. And that particular toupee still existed when I was a child, and it was part of Grandma's dressing up box in her shed along with the gas masks. And I remember wearing that very often. In fact, I sometimes wore it because Granddad told me to put a hat on because I'd go mad.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure he told you all at school. Any of you here who were taught by Granddad, I'm sure he told you to keep your head out of the sun. But Granddad was of his time, so I don't like the next picture at all, but we've got to see it. There we go. Colonial times, Granddad being carried by native bearers in the hammock. As I say, I'll move on from that. What is the next slide, please? There we are. So I don't know what happened after the war to them, but obviously they had this meeting somewhere or other, and which year it was, and then they did their courting, and then they got married, and then they came to Hatfield Heath, and this is what they look like. And I think they're a handsome couple, don't you? My grandmother was very proud of her hair as a young girl, and she said one of the children, she did tell me who it was, but I can't remember now, used to love brushing her hair and would say, "Oh, you've got lovely hair, miss." She keeps saying that she brushed it. I think Grandma was quite vain about that. And as Granddad's got a steely eye ready for any helpers and schoolboys there. So they came to the Heath, and where they first lived was where my mother was born, was one of the houses between the factories, as I said, now, and the mill on the right. But I don't know which house. I really can't remember, and I don't know how many times my mother said I was born there as we walked past. And interestingly enough, she died in Broomfield, so her whole life sort of ended up, start and finish within about 250 yards, which is probably quite an unusual. But, so no, I don't know that, but eventually they bought, I think in about 23, 24, they bought Heathfield, as we knew it, which was a family home and the one I knew and loved and visited all the time, and many of you have gone there. And at the time, Heathfield, the land they bought, I believe, stretched up nearly to where the police station was, so a lot of land. And the schools had no, because there were two schools, of course, had no playing fields, and they actually did turn that land into playing fields. And they used to troop down there to play football and so on the fields, but they sold off a lot of that land, but ended up with a large plot, but nowhere near as much. But I suppose that was spent on other things over the years. So, sorry, go back to my notes now. So what was the Heath like when they got there? Well, two dramatic stories to illustrate differences here. Grandad arrived in April 1921, and he was in charge of the British school. Grandma was in charge of the national school, and then they combined a few years later, and Grandad was number one and Grandma was number two. But that first year, at the end of the school term, which must have been 2 or 3 months later, it was on the last day, and the children were out playing, and a coach turned up with footman driving it and two very grand people in it, and it was Lord and Lady, I think it's Rockwood, you'll have to correct me, but the people from Down Hall who owned it at the time, and they pulled into the school, and Grandad went and asked them what they were doing, and said, well, we come here every year and we choose the boys for the farm and the girls for going in service, which ones we want. And Grandad didn't think much to that and sent them on their way and said that from now on the children will decide what they want to do themselves, and that habit stopped. And the other thing that he often told me about, because he liked making my stomach churn, was I think it was 23, that it was on the Broad Oak Road, there'd been an accident and somebody had got their leg caught up in a farm machine, and the doctor couldn't extract it and said I'd have to amputate, and he didn't have any anaesthetic, so they forced brandy down him, and then Grandad and 3 others held him down while the doctor sawed. You wouldn't find that nowadays. There was a time when the village was ruled by the doctor and the schoolmaster and the vicar, so I don't know if the vicar was there as well saying prayers for the poor chap, but he did survive apparently. So thank heavens we're 100 years on. So thank you. He quickly became involved, very, very involved in village life and doing all sorts of things for the school, like putting up once they got playing fields, putting up a maypole, and country dancing became a tradition under my grandmother and then of course my aunt. Music they brought to the school, make your own, for those who went there, make your own bamboo flutes. There used to be stacks of those still at Heathfield when they died. If you remember, with skewers to make the holes in them. And of course, village life as a whole, because in those days, the school teachers, they lived in the village and they were part of the village. There was no separation as there is now. So Grandad automatically joined the cricket club and the football club and played for them. And he became a lay preacher and a church warden and a district council and the chair of the parish council. And he started the Welcome Club and got involved in the Institute. Oh, and he also started the Royal British Legion, and I did find amongst my papers all the paperwork to do with building the War Memorial. He'd obviously organised that, but I passed it on several years ago to the Legion in Hatfield Heath. So you can see he was instrumental in so much, but fairly full of himself. He was always full of himself in his life. I wish it makes me at Christmas dinners that Grandad would start holding court, and I was amazed at the temerity of his wife and two daughters to tell him to shut up quite specifically, which I don't think anybody else on the village would have. But there we are. My grandmother was definitely in charge, and that again, the fact that grandmother could tell Grandad off, I was very impressed by. But outside the house, things were very different, of course, but that was the way it was then. So what else did they do in the 20s and 30s? Lots of shows as well on the village. And here I have to give a health warning, because a lot of the papers, and these are shows on Hatfield Heath, and they're early Heath Players ones, if you like. And, well, I have to say it, they were nigger minstrel shows right up into the 30s. And Grandad, when he died, we lodged a lot of his papers in the Essex archive, and some of them now, and I looked it up yesterday, you cannot access them anymore. They're there, and there's a list of what they are, but nobody's allowed to see them because they are now so offensive. And one of the titles, I won't read many of the titles because they really are offensive now, but one I will read because it is so shocking. And here it is. 1925, copy, oh, sorry, I'll move on. Extract from The Teacher's World. And these extracts are Dialogues for a Nigger Troop and Nigger Dialogues.
Oh,
Yeah, so the teachers were all backing it as well those days. So, and I must admit, grandmother still did like the black and white shows in the 1960s, and I bought the for Christmas. There we are. We don't judge history that way, do we?
No.
But as I say, a lot of shows, and then of course, the children. What do I say about the children? I think they were quite a rough lot when they got there, he told me. He needed a lot of getting into line. It wasn't the easiest to start in the terms, the children were farm labourers' children and so on, and they'd been allowed to do whatever they did, and my grandfather had a different vision, but eventually got into line. But I think at times things could get a bit physical, though he always used to say to me proudly that he never used the cane in the last 12 years of his career. So that would have been from 1944, so that's not bad, I guess. But and they introduced people, so much they introduced, let's say, those things. And actually, because he could decide his own curriculum mostly, along with the Reverend Horsey, who was the chair of governors, and from what I could gather, it wasn't always a harmonious relationship, but needless to say, in those days, I wasn't told as much as perhaps children are told now. So, oh yes, the other thing about that time that Grandad loved to tell me about was his relationship with the Countess of Warwick, who of course was very involved in education and would often invite him out there to Little Camper, to the hall and so on. So he was well, it wasn't the hall then, it had all been burnt down in the monkey fire during the war, of course, but the First World War. But he did see her a lot, and he'd tell me all about that. So that was good. And that was where, as I say, my mum and daughters and aunt lived, and they lived in some comfort. I mean, my mum used to talk about the maid they had, because my grandmother was teaching, and they had a maid during the 30s and so on who looked after the children. And we'll have that slide of Mum and Helen, please, just to show them. There we are. There's my mum, the taller one, and Helen's looking somewhere nice with a very 30s look. And so come to the war. So needless to say, Grandad got very involved indeed as headmaster, and he was made billeting officer. And at one time, they were actually using Trinity Hall and the Institute, can you believe it, to billet people in, because it wasn't only all the people who had come out from London, and it was adults as well came out in the first rush of evacuees. It was, the army had to be billeted and all sorts of things going on. So he was very involved in sorting the village out. And it was also him that allowed for and pushed it through the land down at Pincey Brook that the gypsies came to from East London. So the gypsy camp was started by Grandad, if you like, and he was very welcoming to them and encouraged them to the school and was very happy for them to stay on and settle as they did after. So that's good on him. He loved it when the USAF came, because he was very proud of his resemblance to Winston Churchill, I needless to say. And one of the officers from the USAF used to turn up occasionally with I got a cigar from Mr. Churchill here. Grandad would smoke a cigar every Christmas, and that's the story he would tell us. I love it. But what else of the family? Now, my mother, who by this time had left school, I don't quite know what she was doing, but this is a confession, I'm afraid. This is a warts and all, as you probably gathered, of the family. But she was caught cycling in the blackout with her lights on.
Wow.
Now, you can imagine the effect. I would have hated to have been a fly on the wall, I think. So what slide, please. What was the fate of Mum for this, apart from the 10-shilling fine?
Wow.
Yes, she had to join the RAF and leave the village and go and pound up and down Blackpool Sands for 13 weeks. And then she was a Morse code operator near Leighton Buzzard and Bletchley, of course, where my father by that time had been based. And that's where they met. And that's where they got married. And that's where my sister was conceived. And my mother obviously left the RAF. My father stayed on until about 47, I think. And they lived in Saffron Walden for a while. Then they came back and lived with my grandparents, and then they got the house in Brookfields, where they both lived forever after that, really. Not in that house, because they moved to a smaller one. So she had a lovely time in the Air Force. Whenever we watched anything like the Remembrance Day, she would always tell me the RAF drill better than anyone else. My father was more circumstanced. I once asked him why he never went to Legion things, because they were very big in the 50s. And he said, because I said when I left, I'd never march again. But father, of course, was Irish, and he was an orphan, so he was very much taken into the bosom of the family, which was great. And so the war ended, and during the war, my grandfather made an innovation, and that was with Josie Smith, if anyone remembers her, and they actually introduced free school meals. So if you all remember those days, and then that of course became a general thing, and people were driving the meals around, and the canteen got built, and the government took it over. But that had started then, and then we've got a few years after the war, and Grandad, I think, saw himself down. I hear more adventures then, because at one point Grandad was teaching in the school. Grandma by that time had retired because of ill health. She had a lot of trouble with her blood pressure. But my aunt was the teacher, having done her teacher training, and my mother was the school secretary. So there's a bit of a mafia there. We got it sewn up, education in Hatfield Heath. So as I said, Grandad said he never used a cane during that time, but I know he lost his temper. And there was one person in particular who riled him, and Grandad was so cross chasing him up to the school that my aunt hid him under this pupil under a desk until Grandad had tied down. That pupil was not Bishop Smith.
Ah!
Oh, it was his elder brother, Roderick.
Gosh,
Mm,
right.
If anyone remember Roderick, he's
Yeah.
gone several years now, of course, but he did something to annoy Grandad. But and of course, and then I came along at this time as well, and this is where the title of my little talk came from, because at a young age, people started telling me what my granddad was called to get a rise out of me, and after a few years, it really was neither here nor there. So people were very disappointed. Yeah, I know it's called Toady. But it's more for my benefit. I never actually heard anything bad said about him. Somebody might have said he was cross with me, and then they said, "Oh, he was a lovely teacher," and so on. And I think the effects that my grandmother and grandfather had on their pupils can perhaps best be summed up, not by words, but by two things. Can anyone say if they remember Brusher Wilson?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Brusher, if you remember him, strong as an ox. Is it true
Yeah.
he carried a piano on his own up the stairs of
Yes.
the stand? Did he
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah. Apparently
Yeah,
that's
I
like,
understand. Well, Brusher had those big, thick pebble glasses. He was almost blind without them. And he'd had them since a child. And the lenses used to come out. And my grandmother used to bring them for him as his teacher. And he was still coming to her house when she was in her 80s and he was in her 60s if his lens had fallen out of his glasses.
Lens the back of his glasses.
Yep.
And his grandmother used to put them back in his glasses.
Yeah. And the other one's Bill Bruty. Of course, all of you who know Hatfield Heath will remember Bill. And Bill, of course, became very big in regional FA footballs and politics. And he'd be off to meetings and conferences all over for the whole eastern region. And if he had to give a speech, he'd come down to Heathfield where the grandparents lived and get Grandad to help him write it. Right through into his 60s and 70s, he was doing that. That's nice, isn't it? You know, that's my teacher and he's still helping me. Isn't it? I'm quite proud of that. I was lucky because I went to school there in '56, so he just when he retired, so I didn't have the pain of being at school with the headmaster, but a closer run thing because you know you still lived with the reputation, those dreaded. I know who your mother and I also used to get. I know who your grandfather is. But he, however imposing as Michael put it, Mark put it, he was, to me, he was just Grandad, and I can just remember sitting on his lap. But of course, and he was never anything than loving. I mean, he might have reprimanded me sometimes or warned me off. But I still remember, though, the feeling, because so many people told me about, oh, he told people off at school and he's very cross, this, that, and the other. And I was lived in fear as a child that one day he'd lose it with me as well. He never did, so that was fine. I don't think Grandma would have allowed it. Grandma was great. She had all the time in the world for me. And as I say, she wasn't that well. And she loved her shed, but she was a useless cook. So. But she did love cards. And if you remember canasta, which went on forever, she was a canasta thing. So I'd play canasta with her for hours because I loved it as well. And she'd suddenly say, Ralph, put that paper down, play canasta with the boys and come grumbling to the table and have to play cards with me. But also with my brother and I, because he was such a great bowler. I liked to bowl. I wanted to be a leg spin bowler. And he'd play with me for hours. He'd put a handkerchief down on the tennis court there at Heathfield, and I just bowled at him for hour upon hour. Him making me pitch on the handkerchief. And of course, that tennis court as well was great because of bringing friends in. I don't know if you played tennis there, it was a wonderful facility. And Grandma used to play tennis with me despite her ill health until the late 60s, I'd say. She'd still come out there for a knock around, and she was quite spry, believe it or not. So that was always an excitement. And I'm rifting a bit too much here, I'm afraid. So I want to go back to Grandad and the Legion because that's probably of what he vocalized, the thing he was, apart from his teaching, was the thing he was most proud of, being a founder member in the year that Earl Haig announced its founding. And on his 50th anniversary of the Legion, and he did reach sort of the high levels of it, he was given a golden medal by the Queen Mother on the stage of the Albert Hall, which he was very proud of. But his British Legion medal had another effect. And Grandad, it's another story about him going abroad I'll come to, but after the First World War, Grandad or Grandma never went abroad again. until my father took me and them to stay with his aunt in her boarding house in Dublin, which again was quite interesting because the boarding house was by the seaside in Dublin, but it was where Dublin was very poor. I mean, children were all barefoot there. And this boarding house, the guests were all men from the horse breeding counties and the dog breeders from Cork up for the horse trading show. So there were all these fast talking Irishmen selling horses and dogs, and my grandfather, and it was quite a mix. And we went to Dublin Museum, and there's a special exhibition there of Wolfe Tone, who was a great 18th century Irish rebel and politician and revolutionary. And grandfather realised he had his British Legion badge on and quickly and surreptitiously took it off. He was a bit nervous that day, but things were fine. That was interesting, taking him there. But so the Legion really was his life, and he'd go away to his conferences at Walton-on-the-Naze or Clacton, and I'd be taken with him. So he'd go into the conference for the day, and I'd sit on the beach with Grandma, which is always quite nice. And they were always taking us children off on trips everywhere. But the most dramatic, I was alive but don't remember, they took my brother and sister, as they'd have been about 9 or 10, for the day out. And that was the day of the 53 floods. And they spent the night in the car, the old Ford Popular, at Battlesbridge, surrounded by water. Luckily survived, but as I say, I don't remember it, but it was often talked of that night, as you can imagine. But, oh yeah, I meant to tell you something about my father. It's an interesting coincidence, this. I said that my father was an orphan, and in the early years of his life, he was brought up by his grandparents. And his father was the steward on the big Anglo-Irish estate in Limerick. And the man who owned that estate was Robert de Vere, who was a descendant of the Robert de Vere who is buried in Hatfield Broadoaks Church in the 13th century, no, 12th century. So it's rather strange for him to come from one de Vere to another like that. Small world, as they say. So can we have the next picture, please? So there we are, there's our family. In the early 1960s, isn't it? My dad there, towering above everyone, my mum, my Aunt Helen, my grandmother, my grandfather, my brother, me, and my sister. And I'm the last one of that lot. So, as I say, I can tell you anything I like about them, and nobody will know. It's a wonderful story. Looks as though it's Christmas there. We had fantastic Christmases. And again, it's the school teacher bit, and you'll recognise a lot of this. Christmas, after lunch and in the afternoon, it was the Queen's speech, which goes without saying. I can't remember, and I think we stood for the national anthem. And then it was music, and there was a piano that usually 2 people were on. There was a small organ, the pedal-powered one. There was a cello. I can't remember what else, but various instruments other people played. They had loads of copies of the Oxford Book of English carols, and that's what we'd do. We'd sing carols to music on Christmas afternoon, and lots of relatives would come from Saffron Walden as well, and it was great. But the only bit I ever hated was when they said, right, good King Wenceslas now, because that meant Grandad was the bass king, and guess who was the boy treble page? So he comes home yonder. I hated it. But that was Christmas, and very joyful it was as well now, then. So if we take me on to the next picture, please. So there we are, golden wedding anniversary with a new addition on the right there of Helen's husband Terry, and she married him in her 40s. He made Christmas different because he was the fool in the Thaxton Morris side. So Christmas then you started getting beaten up with pig's bladders and things. It was anyway. That's Helen and Terry, and on the left there is Lynn, who's still alive. She lives in Somerset and breeds dogs, and she's my brother Tim's widow. So there's 3 of us still alive in that photo. And if I could have the next picture, please. I just put that in just for indulgence, because that's 4 generations of children of grandmother, my mother, my sister, and my niece. No, I just thought it's rather nice. And they're at the back of my grandparents' house there. And sometime my sister was over from Australia, probably about 36 years ago. So if I could have the next slide, please. So there's Grandad, still in his hat, and retired by now. His party's over, and it's his last year. But he still had a lot of him in him. And it's at this time that Grandma and Granddad decided to go on holiday. And there's a lot of planning and a lot of soul searching and a lot of worry, but they went. And the worry was a reception again because they went on a cruise up the Rhine. And so there they would be amongst Germans after their 2 wars and so on. But they came back and they were full of it, and they thought Germans were lovely people just like us. So that was good. That's a very happy holiday for them in their 80s. They were, of course, getting frailer and frailer, but still a lot about them. Here I'm going to tell you a story that still traumatises me. Their bungalow in Hatfield Heath, I would just walk in and out of. You know, the door was never locked, and I never knocked. You know, I'd been going there since a very small child. I virtually lived there. So I walked in one day, and there was Grandad on his own, with no trousers on, his feet in a bowl of water, and learning his lines for a Masonic ritual. And he didn't cover his pale legs or hide his secret book of words from me. Well, I was transfixed in horror at the whole scene, but we never spoke of it after. He didn't. Grandad was on it quite a lot. I seem to remember some big do in the village where there was a big presentation to him, but there was a lot of things like that went on, and he slowly slipped down, and my aunt and Terry came back and lived there to look after him a bit, and but then he got Alzheimer's. Well, he got dementia. I don't think they knew what sort of dementia in those days. And his last days, he was nursed, and this is fabulous. It was Olive Mays. She used to come to the house every day to nurse him and dress him and wash. Well, he's bedbound by then, but there are all the things you have to do. And I remember sitting by his bed, and he suddenly had a lucid moment. And he looked up, his eyes opened, and he saw I was sitting there, and he just said, "I want to die, boy." And he got his wish a few days later. And it was about 2 weeks short of their diamond wedding anniversary. We had to stop the card coming from Buckingham Palace. I lived on a few years, and Helen looked after
Diamond wedding.
And that was a very special time for me because I was very, very close to my grandmother. And by this time, she was going to bed at about 7 at night. And if Helen wanted to go away anywhere, I used to just go and stay for a night or 2 with her, which I loved. It was so peaceful, and she was in bed, but I was having quite a quiet, lively life, and that was a real haven. The last thing my grandmother I can remember doing was, well, 2 things really. Is when I was courting my wife, my mother asked her to make a cake for my grandmother for her birthday, which she did. And then we saw her later that evening, and my mother said, "Grandma, little mum, this is Gillian. She made the cake." And my grandmother said, "Made me sick." And then when my son was born and I inherited a stepdaughter, I took them to see them, and she gave them a 20p piece each.
Ah,
I loved it. So anyway, she broke her hip, and that was it. She broke her hip and died basically of pneumonia, as happens to so many people. She was about 90. My aunt, she went on to be headmistress of Birchanger School, and she lived in Harlow, where she died a few years ago. Very happy and very involved in musical life. Very adventurous woman, my wife. She went to teach in Atlanta in America for a year in the 50s, where she made lifelong friends, and she'd go over there a lot and join lots of American folk dance groups and so on, and American folk dance groups would see her here. And she got very involved in the Morris dance with Terry, and she used to take me to Cecil Sharp House in London, where all the folk music originated. Cecil Sharp, of course, collected all the folk music in the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And Helen, before she found Terry, was always a great matchmaker for us. She actually found Janet's husband, and Tim, she found someone he got engaged to, but then he broke it off and found his own. She tried hard with me, but failed. But I do remember her taking me to Southend with some poor young 13-year-old girl who was the daughter of a friend of hers. I was 14, and she put us on the tunnel of love, and was standing there grinning at us as we came out of the rain. It was awful. But I dearly loved Helen. She was very, very sporty as well. She had a very, very wicked sense of humour, I can assure you. Oh, last picture, because we mentioned Grandma last, and we haven't seen Grandma. Here she is. So what can I say? I mean, I've just done it for an hour, haven't I? And I'm sure I meant to say things I haven't, but I'm quite open to question. I hope it's been historical enough. It's been quite deliberately personal because I know most of you will know something, one or two don't, but most of you know something or a lot of the people involved. And you'll know the history and you'll know the institutions. But, you know, oh, I forgot to say about Grandad's cricket, my last story. Grandad, of course, was a great cricketer, and he tells two stories. And one of them was of a blacksmith from Hatfield Broadoak who used to stand up behind the stumps, and as the ball came towards him past the batsman, he'd flick off the stump with his finger and shout, "How's that?" and get them out bowled. And one day, a very, very small batsman, this was in the 20s, got very, very irate by this. The last thing we saw was this huge blacksmith running down the Broadoak Road with this little batsman running after him with his bat. The other thing that they did was he was a hitter. I'm told he did put a ball into the Stag Yard once, but he also put the ball through the window of a car driving on the road through the middle of the pitch. The car took the ball to Epping Police Station and made an official complaint. Yeah. So that's all I've got to say. But I'd happily chat away or answer any questions.